a plea agreement that could potentially be violated due to restitution? Come on, ladies and gentlemen. It finally hit me in the side of the head. I get it now. I fully get what's going on in the Idaho 4 case. Hey, ladies and gentlemen, I'm ARHayes. This is Convict's Thoughts. It's great to see you back. I appreciate you joining me as we dive back in on this November 5th, where the hearing for restitution took place in Judge Hippler's courtroom, even though the attorneys on both sides, prosecution and defense, didn't even attend the hearing. It was all done via Zoom. Bryan Kohberger, nowhere to be found, because guess what? In most cases, these hearings don't ever even happen the way this one did. Been through the system, ladies and gentlemen, like many of you know, and for those of you that do not, I'm an ex-convict. I've been through the penitentiary system. I've been through these very scenarios, restitution hearings, far more than once. And let me tell you, I've only attended one, and it was my very first restitution hearing, and I learned my lesson. I never needed to attend again. Waste of time. The arguments are typically baseless, and they're typically led by the prosecution, which in this case, even though the narrative being pushed out there by mainstream media and so many when it comes to Bryan Kohberger and the defense team, it's all being pushed that it was Bryan Kohberger that did not want to pay the restitution. He did not want to make the victims' families whole in their request for money. Ladies and gentlemen, that's not the case at all. And we learned all of that today in the very courtroom as we watched via the live feed. And we're going to get into that, ladies and gentlemen, the live feed of a restitution hearing. Unheard of. But this is the Bryan Kohberger Idaho 4 case. So now put it on the map. It's heard of now. The prosecution had filed for additional restitution to be added to the $250,000 that Bryan Kohberger is set to pay in criminal fines on top of the $80,000 split 4 ways between the victims. That's right. The Gonsalves family wanted an additional $20,000 for travel expenses and earns. Well, they wanted $20,000, and the Madison Mogan's mother wanted an additional $7,000. So we were in a restitution hearing in the courtroom today, listening to a debate over $27,000 that ended very quickly when the prosecution notified the judge, Mr. Stephen Hippler, that they actually withdrew prior to all of this the request for said restitution because it violated the plea agreement and what was written in what's considered, that's right, remember, hold right here, a plea agreement is a written contractual agreement. It cannot be changed. It cannot be manipulated. And the prosecution knew that, and they withdrew, even though they still filed everything. Stephen Hippler did not cancel this very restitution hearing, and we'll get into why here in just a minute, because I figured it out. I did. I put my thinking cap on, well, my convict's thoughts cap on, and I put my mind to work, and I figured it all out, and it makes sense to me now. Makes sense to me now. But even though the prosecution had withdrawn, they still pushed that they felt as though the earns for both Madison and Kaylee should be included into that restitution under the funeral cost. So a little over $3,000 to be added for the Gonsalves family and the Bogan family. And at the end of the day, even though we did hear the defense argue about that, and while they were somewhat arguing about that, it was Stephen Hippler that took every chance he got to push this issue on the defense that Bryan Kohberger should make these families whole. Bryan Kohberger should not be violating this plea agreement. That's right, ladies and gentlemen, if the plea agreement was violated, guess where we'd be? Right back at the start. We'd be facing the death penalty and moving forward, most likely to trial. So in my thought process, I was like, throw it. Throw this right now. Let's go to trial. Throw that plea agreement and come on, Massa, step up to the table. But they didn't. They didn't. And Hippler said he was going to take everything that was stated today under advisement, and he would make a ruling on it very soon. Now, the prosecution has to be pushing the very issue that they wanted everybody and anybody out there to know that Bryan Kohberger supposedly got 5 figures worth of money put onto his books prior to the plea agreement. And they were concerned that any money moving forward, because guess what, ladies and gentlemen, money flows in the penitentiary, and there's a good chance that money will flow onto Bryan Kohberger's books. It happens, and there's ways around the whole restitution that Bryan Kohberger is going to learn to where he'll still be able to get his commissary, spend his money on his phones and everything without having to pay that restitution, because you learn it very quick. You learn the ins and the outs of the penitentiary. You learn how to use other people's books, and you definitely learn how to utilize other ways of moving money to get your store. Like cash on the streets is always worth 50% more in store than what you would order via your own spending account. Meaning that if you send $150 to the rent for the yard, that's right, you get up to $300 back in store. It's a great way for the yard leaders to get the yard rent paid, while you yourself get to eat a little bit better and for a little bit longer. But we'll get into more of those details another time. Ladies and gentlemen, the Idaho 4 case has proven itself out to be one thing, and one thing for sure. It's a money grab across the board. At this very hearing today, and I know this is a little bit different take than what most people are sharing out there with you. You got the mainstream narratives that are pushing that Bryan Kohberger doesn't want to pay the restitution to the victims' families because he has an obsession of control. Okay, that's mainstream's narrative, and it's false. False. And then, of course, we got the push that the defendant could be making the money via his family, writing books and selling different parts of this case off to be able to fund his stay in the penitentiary and help pay for his phone calls and his food. Ladies and gentlemen, if I had anything to say about that, I bet you, just in my opinions, that Bryan Kohberger would give the money to his family before he ever took the money from his family. It's just my thoughts and my opinions. But let me tell you this, across the board, this case, Idaho 4 now, has become the biggest money grabbing case in the history of crime on all facets, including even here on the YouTube streets. As you can see, we as content creators can't stop talking about the case. Some of us do it just because we enjoy it. Like I myself don't make much money via YouTube. This isn't a grifting expedition for me. I just enjoy the community. I enjoy talking about it. I enjoy bringing knowledge. Others are fighting to try to prove that Bryan Kohberger either did or did not commit this crime. Their whole interest is actual truth and justice. Where others, trust me, this is a very good way to earn an income. And it doesn't just come down to YouTube. This is mainstream media's ploy for income. Think about their viewerships. Think about how many people have clicked in and listened to what they had to say about Bryan Kohberger and the very Idaho 4 case. Because if that wasn't the case, if it wasn't an eye-opening experience for everybody, mainstream media would have darn well moved on. Have you noticed that they're covering the Idaho 4 case still, even today, after the plea agreement, after the sentencing, after even some of them have said, this man's locked up, we can move on now? They have not done so. Nancy Grace, Ashley Banfield, Brian Enton, and all of them alike are still talking about Idaho 4. So, this is my thought process. My little bit of a theory is, why not draw this out as long as you possibly can, even putting the most ridiculous of hearings in the public view for all to tune in and talk about. A restitution hearing that literally came down to $3,000. $3,000, but the information that was passed along in that very hearing that all could see, because it was made visual to everybody for no reason necessary other than it's the Idaho 4 case, now has opened the door wide open for at least another few months worth of discussions. Think about the money that's going to flow through mainstream media. But wait, it doesn't even stop there, because this now not only opens up the door to the Lifetime series that's coming out, movie, whatever it might be, which is already a big discussion, but what about all the other endeavors that have already come out, all the documentaries, all the 48 hours, the Datelines, the 2020s? I mean, it's never going to stop. This is going to be the hit case for the next 15 to 20 years. Nobody's going to stop talking about it. Why do you think that it's taking so long to unseal the documents? They've got to release them at spur of the moment, very strategic times, to keep this case in the very view of all to be discussed. Does that mean it's going to change the outcome for Bryan Kohberger? Most likely not. But I'll tell you this, it could potentially help Kohberger if it does stay on the very open market for all to see, because that's going to allow time for people to investigate and people to dig in deeper, and maybe some bigger, highly funded organizations to step in and request more evidence, more investigation to see if Bryan Kohberger is or is not the actual perpetrator of this crime. And it may open up the door for them to pursue others that could potentially be involved in the case as well. Now, ladies and gentlemen, it's not my pleasure to have to talk about how Everybody across the board is making money off such a tragedy. But at the end of the day, when the prosecution was going after Bryan Kohberger and even Bryan Kohberger's family because he potentially had gotten 5 figures worth of income or money donated to his spending account while he was in jail, nobody in return has looked back the other direction and asked the very question, why are families that have been awarded not only the restitution that they've been awarded, but they've gone through the process of fundraising themselves for the very costs of everything that they claim within the restitution request for additional income. They had GoFundMe set up to be able to travel to and from. They had GoFundMe set up to help them with any type of financial situation that arose. They clearly raised more money than what's ever been donated to Bryan Kohberger. They themselves have pocketed more money in this case just via donations than they would ever have been awarded restitution. And I'm not saying that they shouldn't have gotten that money. That's not my place to say. But I think it's wrong of the prosecution to bring up accusations against the financials of Bryan Kohberger without exactly what the defense team states needs to happen, which is a financial analysis to determine whether Bryan Kohberger could even afford more in restitution. And ladies and gentlemen, yes, those financial analyses happen in each and every single case that is being awarded a restitution rate. They happen in every state. They happen on every case. There's no reason why it should not be transpiring in the Bryan Kohberger case. I heard it with my own ears, just like everybody else. People are coming at, and it came right out of the judge's mouth, that the Kohbergers could potentially write a book or profit off of this crime. And then Ann Taylor and Massoff directly stated that's not in the works whatsoever. And from what I know, from the people that I engage with and the people that I get my little tidbits from, that is not at all in the works or a want or need from any of them. They didn't even want a GoFundMe set up to help them financially, much less do they want to profit off of the crime. They are better people than that. The Kohberger family deserve more respect and credit than that. Just because they want and do support their son, their loved son, Bryan Kohberger, they support, does not mean that they need to be attacked or accused that they could potentially, in a speculative nature, do something in the future just to fund their son in the penitentiary. At the end of the day, ladies and gentlemen, we literally just had another very public hearing for only one simple reason. It's to keep the money train rolling. It's to keep this case in the discussions because that's what's going to prompt the sales of books. That's what's going to fund mainstream media's push to continue talking about this very case. That's what's going to put money into the University of Idaho's pocket and anybody else in the near future that wants to come out. So many are worried about Bryan Kohberger potentially telling his story. What about Brent Payne? What about Detective Mowry? What about all these other law enforcement key integral parts that potentially were part of the leak to begin with? What about Judge Hippler? What about Bill Thompson? What about Ashley Jennings? They're all capable of earning a buck off of this very case. They potentially already are. And that's what's so sad. And that's why I know now why it's happening the way it is. I had so many questions. Why isn't the evidence just being released? Why is so much so hidden? Why are lies continuously being told? Why are narratives still being pushed? It's all for the dirty dollar, ladies and gentlemen. And guess what? I haven't given up talking about this case, and I don't mind making a few pennies on the dollar compared to everybody else because it's something that matters to me. I want to bring people the knowledge and the experience that I've been able to go through in how it would pertain to a criminal case like this. Ladies and gentlemen, name me one case where you sat and you watched a hearing in discussion about $3,000 worth up and above and beyond the original specified restitution. Tell me any case that you've had to see a hearing like this that was made as public as this. The lawyers were not even in the courtroom. It was only the judge and the judge's reporters and a YouTube camera. Imagine that. It all played out on YouTube. Is that considered grifting? I'm ARHayes. I appreciate you joining me. Again, another day in the Idaho 4 Bryan Kohberger saga. And we'll see. We'll see where the narrative rolls from here. Have a great night. See you again soon.